Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends, welcome to International Workers' Day, as we should not forget. I didn't actually put Mr. Turkle up to the Edmund Wilson suggestion at all. All that passed between us on the stage earlier was on quite another topic, but I'm glad he did make that comparison because it releases me from the promise that I had made earlier, which was that I would be both short and funny. In the name of Edmund Wilson, I now cast this pledge aside. I trust that you've both, all of you, got comfortable seats and ready to settle down. No intention of being brief. Feeling rather lugubrious, in fact, as well. James Boswell, very long book. Brilliant biography of Dr. Johnson, probably the founding of modern biography. James Boswell, as well as being a very good biographer and remembered for that great portrait of old Sam, that terrible old Tory blowhard Johnson, not the first out of that name, was, in addition to that, a tremendous journalist and very curious man and observer. He would go to things. He would always show up. He showed up at the bedside of the philosopher David Hume, as a lot of people did, because they were sure that Hume would abandon his flinty integrity as the death watch impended. They were sure he would beg for a priest, he would ask for forgiveness. And he didn't, and he kept on not doing it, and Boswell kept on pressing him. Are you sure? Are you absolutely convinced you don't want to do this? And Hume said, I think imperishably, no, I'm no more worried about what will happen after I'm dead and gone than I was concerned with what occurred before I was alive. And I consider that, I've always considered that, and consider it still to be one of the great statements of Stoicism ever made. However, under the lash of comrades Nowacki and Turkle and others, I have been forced to do, born as I was in 1949, a little bit of Back to the Future in my own behalf, and yours, comrades. And the fact is this: I've caused some inquiries to be made, I've looked up some old stuff, talked to some surviving relatives, and the thing of it is that on this day, 50 years ago, this precise day, my parents were on their honeymoon. Okay, you try it. I see some of you are trying it. There's a slightly vertiginous thought to me that this would be so, and I'm going to share with you some of what I think emerges from this matching, without which, after all, one would not be here. My father, I'm a Navy brat. My father, my late father, Commander Eric Hitchens, had in a way a good war. His cruiser, HMS Jamaica, put the last torpedo into the Scharnhorst, the flagship then of the Nazi battle fleet in the narrow seas, on the day after Christmas, 1940. A better day's work than I can ever claim to have done myself, but a tough day's work for the old man, who had, throughout the 1930s, consistently supported the line of Baldwin, Chamberlain, Mussolini, and Franco, and who found himself, you see, because it's my belief that the ironies of history occur most pungently to those who don't believe in them. And after doing in the Scharnhorst, my father was put on the task of running convoys to Murmansk and Archangel at a time when the entire coastline of northern Europe, all the way up over the hump of Norway and Scandinavia, was completely controlled by the Nazi war machine. And there was no air cover for anyone who wanted to sail a ship all the way up and over to Murmansk. And I like to picture my father, as he didn't like to picture himself, as finally, after all the trouble he'd taken in the service of king and empire, acting as a gun runner to Stalin. These are the breaks. For him, May 1st, 1945 was a kind of mixed blessing sort of a day, but it was a day off work, and I think a very much needed one. For my mother, representing the side of the family that had emigrated a little earlier from that bit on the German, Polish, Ukrainian border, which had been, they didn't know, they knew that they weren't hearing anything from the relatives anymore. It was exactly about 50 years ago that they worked out what had happened to all the members of the family they hadn't been hearing from, and it was a very bitter day, and a day of complete silence, and not in fact a day, I think, on which she said anything at all. These were a couple whose lives had been wasted, really, wasted in the terrible waste of the opportunity of the end of the First World War, wasted by those who had written the Pact of Versailles, who had devastated Eastern and Central Europe again in the name of it, who'd plunged the world into depression and into slump, which wasted the youth of both my parents, had encouraged or been complicit in the rise of fascism and brought them out of slump and depression only by means of a war economy and another war, and wasted the rest of their youth, and that was for the lucky ones, and then replaced that regime, that succession of establishment triumphs with the post-war austerity. People whose bitterness, therefore, was very felt, very evident, and who had no target upon which they could direct it, because, after all, they had always done, as they believed, loyally and decently what they were supposed to do, and had kept the national pact and the social pact in an honorable way, and had been betrayed for it. That sort of moment of bitterness and futility is, I suppose, what would now be described in the New York Times as the beginning of the healing process. It's my opinion that the healing process in this case probably began in 1942, when the Red Army managed to encircle the Wehrmacht at the Kursk salient in Stalingrad, box it in and destroy it, and turn it back, and break the spine of Hitler's Reich. I think that's when the healing process began. And I remember an old Austrian friend of mine, now dead, Ernst Fischer, who was one of the broadcasters at Stalingrad. He had defected, he'd joined the other side, and he broadcast in German to the advancing troops and said, "Don't believe your leader, don't believe a word he says to you. Everything he's told you is a lie. He's ruined your country, he's destroyed German and Austrian culture. He's destroyed even the fabric of Goethe and Schiller and Marx and Beethoven and all the glories of your civilization. Don't believe him, and now he's led you into a death trap, and if you don't surrender or come over to our side, none of you will escape," he said. "And you've been dropping leaflets on us, telling us to surrender." In Stalingrad, it's a brilliantly written leaflet, probably the best I've ever read, and it says, "We should tell you now, these leaflets of yours turn into ash at 10,000 feet over Stalingrad. Give up now, turn your guns on your officers, go home, don't believe them, don't believe them." But it wasn't to be. The war had to be fought to the very end. And so, as it ended, and ended in that frigid and ghastly manner, there are three episodes to which I'd like to draw your attention that are part of the history of May 1945. In May 1945, the British government released such Japanese soldiers as it had under its captivity in Saigon, and re-enlisted them under the British flag in order to put down the Viet Minh government, which had established a national government in Vietnam. And under this Anglo-Japanese imperial condominium, proclaimed that it would form a holding provisional government until the French could come home and reclaim their rightful territory in Indochina. That was done with the full permission of the beloved FDR and the soon-to-be even more beloved Harry Truman. And I think it's an episode that ought to be somewhat better known and better remembered than it is. Think of how much trouble we might have saved, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends. If the Vietnamese had got their long-deserved and hard-fought-for independence in 1945, think of the shame also of all of those who've been involved, particularly in the Democratic Party ever since, in denying them that right and using American blood to shed Vietnamese blood. Think of the uneffaceable shame of that. Second, but slightly more encouraging thing that happened. It happens to me when I get into a cab in Washington very often. Washington's my hometown. Sometimes there's one of those old black drivers with a hat back on his head and often a bit of a cigar. He doesn't care about the regulations, about what he can and can't do in his cab. Sat well back in the seat. He hears my voice and he gauges the gear when he hears where I want to go. He doesn't say anything for a bit, but I know what's coming. He says, "You from England?" I say, "Well, as a matter of fact, yes, I am. I don't know how you can possibly tell." And then there's another long pause. He says, "I was there once." And I've had this conversation a lot of times. Very often this was the first time these guys had ever been abroad. Very often it's the first time and the last time they ever went abroad. And they remember, man, did it rain. And we had to drink our beer before it got cold. And boy, the food, but they said, but they remember another thing, which is it was the first time they'd ever been in a society that wasn't segregated. A white society that wasn't segregated. This was a time when German prisoners of war were given a better time than they were. And they remember it in a way that touches me very, very much. And I always say at the end, well, it was very nice of you to come over. You didn't have to do that, and appreciate it. Very much appreciate it. George Orwell noticed a mass observation survey at that point among British public house owners, because it was feared that there were so many British men overseas and the American soldiers were so well paid and so much better dressed that there might be animosity towards them. So they took surveys. One of the old ladies who ran a pub near an American air base was asked, do you get any trouble with the Americans? No, I love the Americans, love the Yanks, love them. Always pleased to see them. What, no trouble at all? I mean, no complaints of any kind? No, very nice boys, always fast to buy a drink, very nice with the girls and all that. Well, you absolutely sure you haven't got any? Well, he said, I will say this, but I don't want to be quoted. He said, I like the Americans very much. I'm not sure I care for some of the white ones they brought over with them. George Orwell was one of the few to notice this finding. Anyway, in my father's hometown in Portsmouth, in Newtown, there was a big riot. The locals all turned out of the pubs when the military police came around to try and drag the black soldiers back from the bar to the segregated camp and said, leave them alone, you're no better than they are. And it was a great moment in Portsmouth history, and it's I don't know, call me sentimental if you will, but one of the guys who was involved in all that was Medgar Evers, who was, when he went back to the United States, thought, I'm going to keep my uniform and keep my medals, I'm going to stay in their face about this. I don't see why I should go back to segregated sharecropping after all this stuff, and didn't, and paid the full price for it, but we're in his debt. And I like to recall this little moment anyway. And then another thing happened, which is that Hitler's chief of intelligence, Reinhard Gehlen, the man who had run the entire Nazi intelligence system throughout occupied Europe for 5 years, was hired by the CIA to run American intelligence from then on. I don't know what you think, but what I think is that when Reinhard Gehlen was hired as head of American intelligence from straight out of Berlin and straight out of the occupation of Belarus and Ukraine and Latvia, I think something very bad entered the American system that no one's really ever been able to face up to or ask about since. It's something really bad that we still haven't combed out or even confronted. And Catherine mentioned the great moment of Ich bin ein Bitburger, spoken in what Gore Vidal called the bright autumn of his senescence by the president, and many people wanted to say, well, that was, come on, he's mouthing off, you never know, not completely all there. Not true at all. The next stop on Reagan's European tour after Bitburg was Madrid, where he made a speech in which he said, I know there's been a lot of controversy about the United States and Spain in their time. Indeed, some Americans once came here to fight in the Civil War. He said, but the thing is, said Reagan, they were on the wrong side. In other words, a conscious choice, a conscious and deliberate remark, showing that the sympathy for fascism, not accidental, not anecdotal, not a slip of the tongue, but something bred in the bone. And I think also worth recalling. Now, those three instances I gave, and believe me, I could go on, and don't be sure that I won't, are not the only three of or Trinity or trio, but I think they may be. I'm going to select them anyway, if only out of consideration for you all, as the crucial three, because they invite the question that is in fact inseparable from meetings like this and deliberations of this sort, which is, which side are you on anyway? We have the civil and human rights side represented by what was expressed by the population of Britain despite its leadership in the resistance to Nazism, and the way that they embraced people like Medgar Evers as guests when they had really, one meal a day. I like to remember that. The origins of the Vietnam War, in other words, the inheritance, the deliberate inheritance by the United States of British and French colonialism, the desire by Roosevelt, this ridiculous hero who's praised up hill and down dale by sentimental Democrats every time you open a paper or turn a page these days, this old crook and criminal who wanted and devoted his life to the inheritance of degraded European imperialism by the United States and made it his objective and got it in Saigon in 1945, and simultaneously the inheritance of fascism, the ghost in the machine, taking on that inheritance, inviting these unwanted guests, no part of any New Deal, into the homeland. That's what you have to remember and choose between and choose among, because the curtain was raised on all this a lot earlier than anyone thought or was told. Now, also in 1945, in fact this month, a great friend of mine was released at the age of 13 from Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. His name is Israel Shahak. He's professor of chemistry at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem now. A great man, arguably a very great man. I'm glad to see he has some sympathizers here. Founder of the Israeli League for Human and Civil Rights, though he wouldn't care, by the way, if nobody had heard about him or cared for him. Founder of the Israeli League for Human and Civil Rights, unbelievably courageous and decent person. I sometimes call him up and say, how are things going in your neck of the woods, Israel? He says, well, I can tell you there are some encouraging signs of polarization. I like to make this one of my mottos. I like to try and start every day. Like, I don't know about you, every day I look at the New York Times and see, are they still saying all the news that's fit to print on the front page? Are they still doing that? So I'm still pissed off with them. Every day I also think, maybe there'll be some encouraging signs of polarization all the same. Because in the New York Times every day you find the word consensus is always used as a plus word. Unity is always used as a plus word. Anything divisive, very bad word. Bipartisan, very good. Partisan, not so good. Cretinism, bullshit, nonsense. The building of a false consensus and the burying of history and the burying of dialectic every day before your eyes in the name of the ideology of objectivity. Who here remembers hearing Ronald Reagan, seeing him called a great communicator in print in a news story? Hands up, anybody? Quite a few. Who remembers hearing him called a liar in a news story? Well, that Ronald Reagan is a great communicator is a value judgment. That Ronald Reagan was a liar is an objective statement of fact. That's why you read the one in the news story and not the other. And that's the ideology of objectivity right there for you. So you need the corrective. And we may need it sooner than we think. The stench in 1945 all across Europe, including the town in which I was brought up, Portsmouth, where I could still see it when I was a small boy, the bomb sites and the rubble and the wreckage, but not all of it, because the stench of 1945 all the way across Europe was the stench of disinfectant being sprayed on rubble. You can't dig anymore, there's no point in it, there's only putrefaction and misery underneath. You can't keep digging if you don't disinfect it. And I would say that the stench of disinfectant sprayed on rubble, the rubble is on top of human remains, is the particular tang, stench, odor of fascism. And we used to, in our movement, in our pages and so on, say we'd give the title anti-fascist to the older comrades, to those who'd suffered and been through it and so on. We never thought, I think, many of us, that how soon we might have to earn this great title of honor for ourselves. Though we were warned. You remember the end of Bertolt Brecht's play Arturo Ui, when the leader steps forward to the front of the stage after Hitler's body has turned to carrion, after all, at last, and says, well, this is the thing that nearly had us mastered, but do not think that that is all, you men, for though we rose up and we beat the bastard, the bitch that bore him is on heat again. And I think the stench of rubble and carrion and disinfectant from Oklahoma is a kind of a warning. And this time it's not digging out at the end, it's digging out at the beginning of a battle with reaction, with the Galenites and their descendants, and with those who wanted to turn yours, my democratic republic into an empire. KKK is Kinder, Kircher, and Kusha too. These rebels, as they call themselves, these anti-establishment figures, are nothing of the kind. They say they're against the government, they're lone pioneers and frontiersmen. Who are they? Where does Gordon Liddy come from if he isn't a pimp of the state? An incubus from the national security system. Where does Oliver North come from? Who dares say this man is a rebel or a dissident? He's an outgrowth of the government. I know, sir. I promised you nothing less. What's anti-government about these extruded forces of the state? They will, when the time comes, if it does come, and we should take care to discuss it soberly, but if the time should come when push came to shove, these are the people who would be the Freikorps, these are the people who would take orders, these are the people who would be the disciplined and docile forces of a government that would, of course, always regard them as deniable, and we have been warned. So I'll save much, but not all, of what I was going to say. Say, let's be prepared not to be hysterical about this. Let's be artistic. Let's be ironic. After all, when Picasso was visited in his studio in occupied Paris by a Gestapo officer who was told to make nice with him, and there was a canvas of a sketch of Guernica on the wall, the Gestapo critic rocked on his heels in front of it and said, "That's very good. Did you do that?" Picasso said, "No, you did." We don't have to be crude. We don't have to be crude. We don't have to be rough, but we ought to be ready to earn the title of anti-fascist for ourselves, and we ought not to be scared of the fighting words, the alleged fighting words of others, of the scum of the earth, of the fat fucks like Rush Limbaugh, and the pimps and pensioners of the state like Oliver North and Gordon Liddy. We should rather be getting ready with some fighting words and some fighting gestures of our own. Thank you.